the stupid people are basically starting to run the whole industry. I'd like to start today by talking about a movie that I really like. It's a pretty funny movie. It's called Idiocracy, and the whole premise of the movie is people have gotten so stupid over the years, and somebody gets put into a cryogenic sleep, wakes up, and then suddenly, even though he was not very smart in our time, ends up being the smartest person around. So one of the things that they talk about in the movie, or kind of make like one of the major points of the movie, is they have what's called electrolytes, which is something you find in sports drinks and stuff like that. Nobody actually knows what they are. I mean, some people probably do know what they are, but all the years that I drank, I won't mention the names of any of these industries that made these drinks, but they always said it has electrolytes on the bottle itself, and you just sit there and go, oh, it must be good because it's got electrolytes. That's kind of the premise of the entire movie. And so what ends up happening is all the crops are dying, and people are not able to figure out how to solve these because, again, everyone's stupid now. So what they do is they hire the guy from way back in our time to solve the problem, and his first thing he realizes is they're using electrolytes, that kind of water, on pretty much everything. So basically, pouring sports drinks into the ground and then trying to see if plants will grow, which they won't. Anyway, so this leads to a lot of people who think, you don't use regular water because regular water is the stuff that comes from the toilet. Yeah, it's that stupid. But anyway, the reason I'm mentioning this is because we're kind of heading that same direction, because we're looking at our ideas of what makes the educational process work, and the stupid people are basically starting to run the whole industry. Lately there's been a lot of talk about cutting back on, shutting down, or just eliminating the Department of Education. Trump has been adamant about either cutting back or shutting down the Department of Education. And as much as people want to make this out to be one of those things that Trump is trying to do and then treat it all as a I hate him or I like him kind of a thing, I'm going to avoid that. The reality of the situation is that it's been a goal of the Republican Party dating back to when Ronald Reagan was president. But why? Well, to explore that question, let's back up a bit and examine this from a few perspectives. First, what is the Department of Education? Then, what exactly is it that they do? And finally, what would cutting back on or eliminating the Department of Education really mean? To begin with, the Department of Education was created as a cabinet-level position in 1979 by President Jimmy Carter. Its main purpose was to ensure that there were equal education opportunities for all Americans, and to coordinate all of the federal programs that had been piecemeal previously into one umbrella organization. And this organization would take care of everything. This lasted for one presidential term until Reagan beat Carter and immediately took steps to try to fold it back into where each section had emerged before. Fast forward a number of decades, and we now have an organization that covers a lot of territory. They handle student loans, lawsuits against schools and states that discriminate against students for all sorts of reasons, including for producing a less than stellar education and for not providing access to classrooms and educational facilities. But slowly, those who don't like the idea of a federal education entity, the Board of Education, have done a great deal to strip the Department of Education of its power, including sell federal loan collections to banks, servicers, and in some cases friends of the members of Congress or the president, who became de facto bankers themselves, even though they were never supposed to be in the first place. One other way a number of detractors have attempted to gut the Department of Education is to institute private schools and homeschooling. This is one of those elusive targets conservatives have had for a long time, because private schools and homeschooling have historically forced those to go those routes to actually pay for the schooling of their children instead of students being forced to go to state-sponsored institutions, which is how most people get their education in the United States. The important question is, why does it matter where students get their knowledge? Well, the answer to that second question, what do you want them to learn? And to answer that, you just have to think through the question of what is the purpose of school in the first place? In 1979, the idea was that young people should be taught the basics of finance, science, history, and mathematics. In 2022, 91.2% of adult Americans had a high school education. Sounds great, right? Well, what if I told you that in 2024, which is just 2 years later, only 79% of adults in America were literate. Adults in the United States, not specifically American. People are being cranked through the system to graduate, but the educational system is doing a much poorer job at actually educating them. Strangely enough, that's the reason the Department of Education was created in the first place. We were supposed to address that issue, but instead the numbers just kept getting worse, and they keep getting worse. We see this all the time whenever a late-night TV host goes out into the population to ask random social science questions to people who live in the United States. The results are almost always the same. People can't tell you where Canada is on a map, how many pints are in a quart or a gallon, or what language they speak in England. It's always been one of my favorite ones. Sure, we laugh at them, but that's usually it. We should be crying and doing something about it, but we never do. If you ask the majority of Americans what the Department of Education actually does, most people would not be able to give you a definitive answer. And that's not because the Department of Education doesn't have an important purpose. It's because Americans are generally clueless at knowing what any part of the government actually does. That's why so many people turn away when we talk about closing the Department of Education. It's not because they don't know what the department does. It's because they think they're smart enough to know without doing something as simple as Googling it in the first place. So let's talk about what happens if they close education. First, it would be a nightmare for the student loan industry. Disbursements are handled by the department, and if we close it, for sure that means some private entity will have to cover that ground going forward, and we can really trust private entities. I'm being facetious. Adding private entities leads us to where we were decades ago, with private corporations ripping off students and Congress having to step in, which they didn't. And they won again. Also, one of the main features of the department is to protect American citizens from those who would treat their education as something less than it deserves to be. There would be no legal team to make sure things are right for everyone, and evil people, or corporations, could do practically anything they wanted to do. Those fears of state actors making teachers educate people in things that are faulty science, bad mathematics, or even historical inaccuracies that someone out there wants to teach, that would become normalized. And there'd be nothing we could do about it. For-profit education, which translates to bad education, would become standardized education. And those decades of gaining traction would be gone. Everything we learned would basically just be passed over, and we would start learning bad things again. Even worse, we'd have such a bad education instead that no one would ever figure out how stupid they've become. We're kind of moving in that direction already. And it's not just because of any party, person, or group that has brought us to this position. There are countries today that laugh at our educational system in various states. And these used to be countries that once desired to emulate us, to become like us, like back the way we were back in the day. A lot less are vowing to be what we are now today. If we tear down the Department of Education, we only have ourselves to blame for where it will drag our future American population. But if it's any consolation, we'll all be too stupid to realize something bad happened. But as long as our drinks have electrolytes, what could go wrong?